'cause it's a daily vlog with Steven Fuller.
Vlog 3, Skepticism. This is a concept I'm really passionate about, and I think that more, especially Americans, but a lot of Westerners could use more skepticism in their lives. One of the things that it isn't, that I think sometimes prevents a lot of people from using it or understanding it, is that a lot of people view it as, negativity or cynicism, things like that, and it isn't that. I think that a healthy form of skepticism is crucial to becoming a critical thinker, and being able to empathize with your fellow human beings and making the world a better place. So I want to talk about skepticism through the lens of my own experience, and then I'll talk about it kind of in a larger context. So I want to trace a few. These are not necessarily the complete story. They're just sort of mileposts along the way. When I was 16 years old, I was in my second job. I grew up in Pensacola, Florida, and I worked at an Italian restaurant called Fazoli's. It was Italian fast food, not legit Italian. And so I was like a server there, a server, cook, dishwasher, all of that kind of stuff, all the high-paying stuff. And I did pretty good at it, and I worked hard, especially when I was working with people. I kind of enjoyed that part of it, and you could get tips and things like that. So one day when I was serving, this couple came in, and I was waiting on them and pretty talkative, and they were engaging me in conversation, and I was answering, mildly intelligently, I guess. And the guy looked at me and he said, "Hey, listen, I've got a job opportunity for you. If you're interested, here's my card." And he handed it to me. So I was kind of like, oh, wow, okay, this is neat. Maybe I can get out of this existence as a waiter. And so I called him up. I told my parents about it, and we decided to meet to hear this job opportunity at one of the local malls. So I went in there, and he started explaining things, and of course it was sort of strange a little bit. It was very roundabout at first, with lots of sort of hype and entrepreneurial sort of event, and I'm sure you can guess where this is going. It ended up being a multi-level marketing scheme, and so he was selling me on it hard, trying to get me involved with it. Then my dad came over. So my dad was there, but he went and sat at another table while I talked, and then at the end he came over and we talked to the guy, and he kind of explained it, and I was hyped up, of course. I was 16, I didn't know any better. I was like, oh, this sounds like a great opportunity, and blah, blah. And my dad kind of listened for a second and then started lighting into the guy a little bit. Not in an angry way, but just calling him out, just be like, this sounds like a pyramid scheme, and blah, blah, blah. And I remember at the time when he started doing this, and it got, you could tell the guy was visibly uncomfortable. I was just sheepishly uncomfortable, and so my dad's saying this stuff, and the guy started getting defensive, and no, this is not all that kind of stuff. And I remember at the time just feeling like, oh, make it stop. I don't want the confrontation was too much for me. We walked away, and I think at the end of it, my dad was like, hey, no, he's not going to get involved with that. And we left, and I didn't know what to think at the time. And it ended up being a really good thing, and I'm thankful that my dad did that in that instance, because that was one of the first experiences that I had when I went and looked up the company to, see what he was talking about. Found out that, it was exactly that. I had no idea what a pyramid scheme was before that, and started reading about it, and that sort of changed my viewpoint on the whole encounter. I was really grateful for it. But at the time, in that moment, it was incredibly uncomfortable and embarrassing, and just the thickness of the confrontation was like, make it stop. Which brings me to, I think, one of the first problems with how people frame skepticism is that it has to exist outside of how you feel about things. And it takes practice. I think it takes practice and effort and self-awareness to get to the point where you can begin to become skeptical and sort of compartmentalize your emotional state in that moment. Now, what I'm not saying is to deny your emotions, deny that you're feeling something, anything. I'm not saying that. You're going to feel things strongly regardless. That is the nature of being human. But to learn to disassociate and say, hey, what I'm feeling right now, what I feel like doing, and what I feel is not necessarily factual or the best course of action or helpful even in this moment. I can process all this in a minute, and I can figure out a productive way to deal with what I'm feeling, but but that's not helping me in this moment. And so to kind of learn how to compartmentalize in order to enact this thing that is going to help you long term, I think is something that everybody should sort of strive for, and it's incredibly difficult to work on because our feelings are so fundamentally a part of who we are as human beings. Next story. I was 21 years old and living in South Korea at the time. South Korea was a coming of age story for me in a lot of ways. It was like my first time living in a different country, thousands of miles away from home, and it changed me in some ways that, to this day, what is it now, 14 years later, that experience shapes who I am still to this day. And it'd be hard to overstate that. I lived on base. I was in the Air Force at the time, active duty. One day, when I had first gotten there, this was within the first 3 months or so, I was learning how to speak, read, and write Korean, but I wasn't at all close to fluent yet, and so, still very much sort of hunting and pecking around when it came to the language. I was walking out the gate, and one of the gate guards told me, he said, "Hey, there's a protest going on outside, make sure you don't get involved, keep walking and get to wherever you're going." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Now at the time when I was 21, I had this really strong worldview at the time. I thought I knew how the world worked, and I won't dip into what the ideology was, but at the time I felt very certain about my viewpoint on things. And I remember after the guard told me that, I was walking out the gate and walking towards this protest, and I remember thinking, we Americans, me included, we're here defending South Korea from the threat of the North, which is so ironic that this is poignant yet again, this conversation, but I'll leave that alone. But I remember that thought entering my head at the time. We're here defending you, why are you mad at us? Very, vindicated. I felt really miffed, They're misunderstanding us, all that kind of stuff. And so I got outside, and there was, in fact, a big crowd outside the gate, and one of them had a megaphone, and there were people yelling, and the guy with the megaphone was in tears, and, I didn't understand any of it, of course, because it was in Hangul, and I was like, okay, interesting. And I saw on the outskirts of the crowd, there was a guy standing there who, from his haircut and clothing, you could just tell he was not military. He was like an English teacher or something like that, but the way he was watching, you could tell he understood Korean and could understand what they were saying. And so I just briefly stopped by him real quick, and I was like, "Hey, do you know what they're saying? Like, what's going on? Why are they protesting?" And he said, "Oh, this is like the 3-year anniversary of when that little 5-year-old girl over there was killed by an American drunk driver." And I looked over, and suddenly, in the crowd, I saw the posters, and I saw the picture of the little girl on the posters. And in that moment, I think at the time, nothing magical happened. I think I just sort of was in this deer in headlights mode, where I remember looking over and sort of going, "Oh." And I didn't know what to do. I was kind of frozen, mentally as well. Just didn't know what to think or say or feel about that for a second. When I think back to it now and sort of interpret it through the lens of, my life and time, I can just remember how that moment effectively has become this, does not compute, my solid, perfectly neat and tidy with a bow on it worldview just cracked in that moment. It didn't make sense anymore, and nothing earth-shattering happened that day. Nothing earth-shattering happened in the next 6 months or the next year as far as, major changes. It ended up taking about 7 years or so for that thread to fully unravel and for it to kind of bear fruit, I guess. And then the final story actually only happened a few years ago. We were living in Virginia, and it was after work one day. My wife had just gotten home. She was getting out of the car, had some stuff in her hands, and a guy came up to the driveway, and I was kind of at the door I was about to go out and help her. And the guy was like, "Oh, hey, I'm your neighbor from around the corner. My car broke down, blah, blah, blah. Can you give me a ride home?" And it was a little weird, but it was like, oh, okay, yeah, I don't know this person, but okay, you know, like, sure, I'll give you a ride. Here, let me get the keys. So, got the keys, got in the car. We started some small talk, and I was expecting for it to just be a 30-second ride around the corner, right? It wasn't. We kept driving, you know, and I was kind of like, oh, okay, so, you know, what do you do? He's like, oh, I'm retired Air Force, and, you know, it's like, oh, yeah, okay, cool, I'm in the Air Force, you know, what was your job? And I can't remember the exact term, but he said something along the lines of like, oh, I did like inventory. And if you, when you're in the Air Force, there are certain terms, there's like jargon and buzzwords that let you know like what somebody does. So like, an inventory is not one of them. You're either a logistics management specialist or your supply, you know, something like that. Like there's terms that you get familiar with that's how somebody who's actually in the Air Force would say it. You would never say, oh, I'm inventory. That's not a job, you know? And so it was like, it just kept getting weirder. And in that moment, like my brain was just sort of shutting down. I was in this fog where I knew something was off, but it was this combination of like, I'm not sure what this guy might do, and maybe it's still okay. Like, and I was just in this paralysis, right? And so then he stopped. He was like, hey, sorry, real quick, can you stop off at the 7-Eleven? And I was like, okay, you know, and so we get out, and then he asked me to buy a pack of cigarettes. And that's when I kind of had my first moment of frustration, and I was like, no, man, I'm not buying you a pack of cigarettes. Like, I will take you to your house, and that's it. He's like, oh, all right, yeah, no, right, you know. And then it dawned on me, but I still, in that moment, I was just in this fog, this mental fog where I couldn't quite bring myself to, like, I should have just left him at the 7-Eleven, right? But instead, we kept going. He took me to this bullshit neighborhood that wasn't his, clearly, and he was like, oh, yeah, that one, that's my house right there. And I stopped, and I watched him. He kept walking, and it wasn't his house, and I felt so sheepish and embarrassed. For a couple of weeks after that, you know, I'm just like, why didn't as soon as I realized something, why didn't I act? And it's a common thing, actually. This happens, actually, this is the same reason to a much scarier and greater degree. You know, some people will often ask a woman who, you know, is going through a sexual assault trial, you know, like, oh, why didn't you fight back? And like, it's the same thing that your brain does. You actually go into this mode where you freeze as a safety precaution, because doing anything, you don't know what could happen, you know? And so that moment was formative as well, because that was actually only a few years ago. Like, I knew better, and I was at a place mentally where I could have stopped it, and I just didn't for some reason. It was very strange. So all of these stories kind of lead me to the point that skepticism can often be a bridge into thinking about your worldview in a more rational way, right? And it has to start with skepticism about your own thoughts. And I think that's where people go wrong a lot of times. They think skepticism is great for you and for others and for those things. You know, that you're the pure arbiter of truth here as you point out, you know, these problems in the world. I think you can't start there. I think you have to start with yourself. You have to start with skepticism about your own motivations. Why am I doing this? Why am I reacting this way? Why do I believe this thing? You know, why do I believe that those people over there are like this? Do I actually know any of them? Have I spent time with them? And if not, why do I think that? Let me find out. Let me correct my information. Let me go see or try to confirm, is that really what they're doing? And I think because so many people haven't taken the time to hold their own opinion with a healthy sense of skepticism and want to go verify and see that it's true, I think that leads to a lot of the prejudice that we see in our politics right now. And if we had more of a sense of skepticism, first and foremost about our own viewpoint and about the limits of our own knowledge, and then after that, with that as a foundation to build off of, a willingness to learn, a willingness to be wrong, a willingness to know the limits of where you are, and then to then say, okay, now because of that experience of me knowing where I don't know things, now this other person telling me this, you know, what's the probability that they're telling me the truth? And I think another thing is that skepticism isn't punitive, or it shouldn't be. In other words, you're not being skeptical to punish somebody. It's not to stick it to them. It's not to get a one-up on them. It's not to prove them wrong. And that's a hit for me personally, that's a hit to my ego sometimes, because it's so easy. That's such a delicate line to walk, where telling somebody that they're wrong becomes this thing that you enjoy out of ego. And it shouldn't be that, I don't think. And I think, again, that's another way that skepticism can kind of get twisted into something it shouldn't be. It's sort of this middle path, I guess, this Zen path of being able to apply critical thought to a person or to a situation or to an idea, but without animus, without anger, without malicious intent, and in an effort to build a bridge of communication with them. And that's the key. I think that's the part that a lot of people miss when it comes to skepticism, is that it's not with that intent. It's to prove somebody wrong, or it's out of anger, or it's out of fear, or it's out of, defense, protection against further pain, that they develop this sort of sense of skepticism. And to let all that go, but keep the skepticism, and to do it in a way where, there's a tinge of optimism underneath of it. I think that's incredibly difficult. And that's why, actually, Anthony Bourdain's death, I think, kind of hit me a little bit, because I watched Parts Unknown quite a bit, and that's what I loved about his show and his perspective. It was very worldly wise, and there was some cynicism in there, but it was always tinged with this bit of hope. Like he just wanted to know more about the people that he was there, and he wanted us to come and experience this and let go of a little bit of our bias too. And he always did it with an air of empathy. And celebrity deaths affect people in different ways. Some may not affect you, some do. And for me, I think his is one that I'm still wrestling with and thinking about, because in some ways I sort of identify a lot with his perspective and his worldview. I liked a lot of the things that he said. I liked a lot of the things that he discovered about the human condition in his quest for eating food authentically with the people who make it. So, what do you think about this idea of skepticism? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Go ahead and leave some comments below, and I'll respond and get back to you, and see you tomorrow.